All right, let's talk about a scientific discovery that is so weird, it sounds like the beginning of a joke. It all started with a single brain cell that seemed to have a strange obsession with a TV star, and it ended up changing how we think about, well, everything. About memory and maybe even about who we are.
So, think about this for a second. Is it possible that somewhere, deep inside your brain, there is one single neuron that is dedicated only to Jennifer Aniston? It sounds completely absurd, I know, but it's a real question that sparked a huge debate in neuroscience.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 2005. A neuroscientist named Rodrigo Quiroga and his team are studying patients with epilepsy. Now, these patients had electrodes implanted deep inside their brains, which gave the researchers this incredibly rare chance to see individual brain cells in action. And what they saw was, well, it was just astonishing. What they found was just how specific these neurons were. I mean, it was mind-blowing. In one patient, a single neuron fired like crazy for different pictures of Jennifer Aniston, but when they showed a picture of her with Brad Pitt, nothing. It went completely silent. Another patient had a Halle Berry neuron that fired not just for her photo, but for a drawing of her, and even for her name just written on the screen. This wasn't just about seeing a face. The neuron seemed to get the whole idea of Halle Berry. Now, this whole thing was a huge shock, right? Because it seemed to bring this really controversial, almost mocked idea in neuroscience back from the dead, an idea they called the grandmother cell. So, what is the grandmother cell theory? Basically, it's the idea that for every single thing you recognize, your grandma, your car, your favorite coffee mug, there's one single dedicated neuron in your brain just for that thing. You know, the name was actually made up to kind of make fun of how ridiculously simple the idea sounded. So this really sets up a big showdown between two competing ideas for how our brains work. Is your brain like a perfectly organized library where there's one single neuron for grandmother? Or is it more like the internet, a huge interconnected web where the idea of your grandmother is actually a pattern of activity flashing across thousands of cells? Okay, so before we all jump on the grandmother cell bandwagon, scientists like Dr. Marta Zimmer pointed out some major holes in the theory. Let's take a look at why it starts to fall apart pretty quickly.
First problem, what happens when you meet someone new? If this theory is true, does your brain need to find a brand new, empty neuron every single time you learn a new face or new idea? It just seems incredibly inefficient for something as amazing as the human brain.
And then there's this, which is maybe even a bigger deal. What if that one cell dies? You know, brain cells die. If your entire memory of your grandmother was stored in one single cell, would one tiny bump to the head mean you'd just forget her? That doesn't sound like a very safe way to store our most important memories, does it? And finally, what about imagination? Try this. Picture a bright blue Volkswagen Beetle convertible, but it's covered in giant purple polka dots. You can see it in your mind's eye, can't you? But there's no way you have a dedicated neuron for something you've never seen before. So how does that work? So all of these problems, right? They all point us away from that simple one cell, one concept idea and push us toward a much more elegant and, frankly, more powerful explanation for what was really going on. So that Jennifer Aniston neuron, the best way to think about it isn't that it's the only cell that knows who she is. No, think of it more like the CEO of Aniston Incorporated. It's the neuron at the very top of the pyramid, making the final call. Here's how this whole pyramid really works. You've got neurons at the bottom, the grunts, right? They're just processing the raw data, simple stuff like lines, colors, and shapes. Then you move up a level, and other neurons start putting those pieces together. They see an eye, a nose, maybe that famous hairstyle, and then, finally, all the way at the top, you have a neuron like the one they found. Its job is to take all that information and go, yep, that's her. That's Jennifer Aniston. You know, this whole rabbit hole, from a single celebrity photo all the way to a pyramid of brain cells, it really makes you step back and ask a much, much bigger question. What even is a memory anyway? It turns out a memory isn't really a thing that's stored in a cell. It's a connection. It's a pathway. It's a whole bunch of neurons that have learned to fire together in a specific pattern. So when you remember something, you're not just flicking on one light switch. You're relighting an entire constellation of stars in your mind.
And this leads to this really wild kind of sci-fi idea from scientists like Sebastian Sung at MIT. He basically says, look, if we could map out all of these connections, what he calls the connectome, we could in theory create a massive dictionary for the human mind. Every single pattern of brain activity would correspond to a specific thought, feeling, or memory. But the sheer scale of this, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. I mean, we're talking about 80 billion neurons in your brain, give or take. And they form something like 100 trillion connections. Trying to map that, it's one of the biggest scientific challenges we've ever faced.
And that leaves us with one last, kind of profound thought to chew on. If everything you are, all your memories, your feelings, your personality, if all of that is just the unique wiring diagram in your brain, if you are your connectome, does that change how you think about who you are?